Dr. Priyam.
Yes, so I shall commence with the first author, the first presenting author, Dr. Neha Shilpi. She will be presenting her talk. Judges, yes. Do we have the permission, please?
What is the height or timing presentation?
Yeah. So, Dr. Neha Shilpi, you can start sharing your screen. You're audible and visible.
3, 4, 5. What was the duration?
Can we have the timer for her, please?
Duration. 4 minutes. Presentation.
Let's start.
There is no
It's visible. Yes.
Yes, ma'am. Okay, so good morning, everyone. I'll be presenting my paper titled Role of Amblyopia Therapy in Children with Repaired Penetrating Ocular Trauma. The authors don't have any financial disclosures. As per the Birmingham Eye Trauma Terminology System, eye injuries are broadly classified into open globe and closed globe injuries. The closed globe injuries are further divided into rupture and laceration, and penetrating injuries are included under laceration. As per the zones are considered, Zone 1 includes injury to the cornea up till the limbus. Zone 2 includes injury beyond that till 5 mm into the sclera, and Zone 3 includes any injury beyond that. So ocular trauma is a major preventable cause of uniocular vision loss in the pediatric age group. The poor prognostic factors include poor visual acuity at presentation, cases with rupture globe, Zone 3 injuries, any associated retinal detachment or vitreous hemorrhage, or dislocation of the lens. So our research question was, would amblyopia therapy help in pediatric ocular trauma patients? The purpose of our study was to assess the visual outcome in pediatric cases of repaired penetrating ocular trauma after amblyopia therapy. This was a prospective comparative study. The study was done from November 2018 to March 2020 at Regional Institute of Ophthalmology, RIMS, Ranchi. Ethical approval was taken from the Institutional Ethics Committee. We included children aged 5 to 10 years with penetrating injury in Zone 1 prepared at our tertiary care center. We excluded patients with Zone 2 or 3 injuries, trauma to lens or posterior segment structures, and those who were lost to follow-up or not willing for follow-up from the beginning were also excluded. Intraoperatively, after thorough wound exploration, repair of the penetrating injury was done using 10-0 monofilament suture. In the post-operative period, in addition to the routine medications, 6 hours daily occlusion was advised for a period of 6 months. Suture removal was done at 6 weeks. The primary outcome measure was visual acuity, which was assessed at 1 month, 3 months, and 6 months post-operatively. For statistical analysis, the data was entered in Microsoft Excel 2010. Continuous data was expressed in the forms of mean, plus, minus, standard deviation, and paired t-test was done to compare visual acuity between different follow-ups and find significance. So coming to results, the total number of patients included in our study was 44. The mean age was 8.23 plus minus 1.49 years. In gender distribution, we saw a clear-cut male preponderance with a ratio of 4.5:1. The mean interval between injury and repair was 33.55 plus minus 12.91 hours. Presenting visual acuity was hand movement close to face in maximum number of cases, that is 19 patients, which accounted to 43.18%. Between finger counting 1 meter to finger counting 3 meter in 17 cases, between finger counting 4 meter to finger counting 6 meter in 7 cases, and 636 in 1 patient. Iris prolapse was seen in 31 patients. The post-operative mean visual acuity in log-MAR was 0.98 at 1 month follow-up, 0.84 at 3 months, and 0.63 at 6 months. When paired t-test was applied, there was a statistically significant difference between 1 month and 3 month visual acuity, and again between 3 month and 6 months visual acuity. Coming to previous literature on these, there is a study on epidemiological profile of pediatric ocular trauma in northern India, which shows that which also shows a male preponderance with a ratio of 2.9:1. Then there is another study by Saxena et al. On the pattern of pediatric ocular trauma in India, and they found that children of 5 years and older had majority of injuries. Again, the injury was more common in boys compared to girls. And they also found that in cases of closed globe injuries, most cases, that is 91.86%, could achieve a final vision of 612 or better. But in open globe injuries, only 17 eyes, that is 15.15%, could achieve this visual acuity. Then there is pediatric eye disease study group that has published 17 amblyopia treatment studies. And the major results from those are patching is an effective treatment of amblyopia. and the ideal number of hours does not make any significant difference whether the patching is done for 2 hours versus 6 hours or 6 hours versus full time. Then there is a similar study on amblyopia therapy in children with penetrating corneal injuries, and they also found that the therapy shows promising result for patients following penetrating intraocular injury despite corneal scar in the visual axis in their study. So to conclude, amblyopia therapy improves visual outcome in children with repaired penetrating zone 1 ocular trauma, and further studies with larger sample size and longer duration of follow-up may provide more insight. Thank you.
Okay. What is your mean age of your study? Mean age.
Yes, so the mean age was 8.23 plus minus 1.49 years.
Yeah, that's a one question. Why you choose in your study for only those? Because is amblyopia basically is beyond 6 or beyond 7 as per the standard textbook.
Yes, sir. So my inclusion criteria was I included children only between 5 to 10 years. That was my inclusion criteria.
That's why I want to know why you include, because in other studies is from all children, but in your studies particularly 5 to 10 years. What is the reason behind?
Yes, sir. So the main reason was, sir, because this was the first study that we did. We are doing it on a larger sample size and for a longer follow-up. But for the first study, just to see that whether the children aged 5 years and more were more compliant in our region, we found that they are more compliant to amblyopia therapy. That is why I chose children 5 years and older. Because what we see in the routine practice here, the children who are younger than that age do not practice the therapy properly.
Okay.
Okay, so moving on to the next speaker, Dr. Shiril Saiwan. You can start
Manoj ji,
sharing.
6 minutes. 6 minutes का timer लगेगा.
Yes. So, yeah, you can start sharing your screen. You're visible and audible. And we have the timer, please. Doctor, you can go ahead, start your presentation.
Good morning, teachers. I will be presenting on beer infected ocular injury in Jharkhand. The study is not funded or not sponsored. Introduction: rural population in Jharkhand comprise 49% of the total population. 75% of the rural population live either population nearby forest, has given rise to the frequent encounter between human and animal, in particular bear, and making them vulnerable to the bear attack. Bear physically charge on all four, causing different pattern of injury on any part of the body, the most affected part being the face and the neck. Injury could range from minor soft tissue injury to the deep laceration, in some cases bony fracture and organ injuries. The aim of the study: to know the incidence, clinical picture, and visual prognosis in ocular and directional injury in the bear bite. Subject and method: it's a prospective, observational, hospital-based, and interventional study. The study range from October 19 to February 2020. Total number of patients is 23 who visited eye OPD and emergency. Segregation is based on the age, gender, severity of the eye injury. Injury are classified according to the beds. Depending upon the type of injury and the complication, treatment were given conservatively, medically, and surgically. Patients were put on for 4 months to monitor the extent of damage and cause over prolonged period. On follow-up, the post-traumatic complication in patient, additional management to the injury, and visual acuity at the time of injury and final visual acuity after the surgery were also studied. In the primary study, 23 cases of bear bite victim were taken to the account. Out of 23 victims, 9 were male and 4 were female. Most of the cases reported after 36 hours of the eye injury. Only 7 cases were reported within 24 hours of the injury. We did 46 eye on the 23 patient. A single case was found with adnexal tissue loss, and rest 22 patients had an open globe injury. Out of those 22, 9 had a closed globe injury on the other eye as well. This is the table 1 showing the age distribution of the patient with ocular injury. The maximum number of patients lies in 21 to 30 year of the age group range, and which is 16. 4 patients were in 41 to 50 year of the age. So total 23 patients were there in our study. This is the visual acuity. Visual acuity at the time of presentation. There were 13 eyes with no perception of light. 14 eyes have perception of light present. 3 eyes have in between the hand movement close to face to the finger count at 2 meter. And after the 4 month of follow-up, the corrected visual acuity after operation is perception of light in 9 eyes, no perception of light in 13 eyes, hand movement in 5 eyes, hand movement to finger count at 2 meter. In our study, 23%, most of the cases were presented late because of the visual prognosis was hampered in greater degree than those presented early. This is a graph figure 1 showing the graphical representation of the eye injuries. The 34% have corneocelular tear, 3% have iridodialysis, 15% have vitreous hemorrhage, dislocation of lens 3%, hyphema 23%, and globe rupture 20%. Figure 2 showing the different type of bear infected ocular injury in the studied patient. Discussion. In India, bear maul injury constitute only 0.1% of animal attack, although they are the most common wild animal infected injury. Out of the injury reported, maximum injury were due to the sudden encounter while doing their morning routine chores, and also when a bear perceived human as a threat and attack in self-defense. Among the cases reported, only one injury case where the victim was mauled when the bear entered the village residential area. We had administered tetanus prophylaxis to all the patients at the time of admission. Most of the eye had multiple type of ocular injury. Eye with lid laceration alone were some sutured with within 2 layer with Vicryl 60. Since the patient presenting globe rupture, eyesight cannot be reinstated. So after medical care and measure,
Hello.
Hello, Doctor.
Sir, I think you are on mute. The presenter. Sir, you are on mute, I guess.
I think there is some problem in the internet.
Yes, sir.
Dr.
Possibly.
Shiril, I can't hear him.
Okay.
Dr. Shiril?
yes, sir.
Yes, sir, you were on mute during the last 2 slides, and we have some time left. So if you want to
Yes,
yeah.
sir. A better understanding of the nature and severity of prognosis of bear-infected ocular and adnexal injury will help develop effective prevention approach to reduce their occurrence in the future. The people inhabiting in the nearby area of forest should be encouraged to do their activity when there is minimal chance of bear encounter. Imparting knowledge and educating about the threat of the bear bite injury and tactics to survive a bear attack to the people residing in the close vicinity of the forest may lessen the frequency of the attack.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Dear moderators and judges, do we have any questions for Dr. Shiril? Just in case if we don't have any kind of questions, I would request Dr.
So,
Priyam
yeah.
to please invite our next
Moving
speaker.
moving on to the next presenter, Dr. Tarini Santamis, are you here?
Yes, I'm here.
Okay, so Dr. Tarini, you can start with your presentation, start screen sharing, you're audible, and yeah, you're visible also. So can we have the timer on, please?
Good morning, everyone. I'll be presenting a paper on factors associated with visual outcome in indirect traumatic optic neuropathy. Traumatic optic neuropathy is a rare cause of permanent visual disability following trauma. In recent years, the incidence has The incidence has increased and it ranges from 0.7 to 2.5%. The injury to the optic nerve can be either direct or indirect. Mechanism of indirect injury is due to stress transmitted through the soft tissues and skeleton, leading to the nerve damage and compression and disruption of the pial vessels, leading to vascular compromise. The treatment options include observation, steroids, and surgical decompression. Visual outcome in traumatic optic neuropathy patients is unpredictable, and the decision to treat or not is yet a question to be answered. So the purpose of this study is to obtain the demographic profile of traumatic optic neuropathy and to find whether low-dose steroids and surgical treatment showed any beneficial effect, and to analyze the possible factors that can affect the visual outcome in patients with indirect traumatic optic neuropathy. So we conducted a retrospective review of medical records of patients admitted in JIPMER with indirect traumatic optic neuropathy from February 2017 to February 2018. All patients who presented within 8 hours of injury and had a minimum follow-up of 1 month were included. Those with direct TON and patients with altered sensorium, as well as patients with associated or ocular injuries contributing to the visual loss, were excluded. These were the data collection included baseline characteristics like age, gender, nature of trauma, time of presentation, associated ocular and systemic injury, clinical characteristics, the type of intervention done, and the visual acuity. The diagnosis of traumatic optic neuropathy was based on the history of acute drop in vision following trauma with RAPD, loss of color vision or visual field defect, and we did CT brain and orbit to look for optic nerve's bony impingement. Patients without bony impingement of the optic nerve were treated with low-dose intravenous methylprednisolone 250 mg QID for 3 days, followed by oral prednisolone 1 mg for 11 days. Those who had bony impingement of the optic nerve in CT were treated with endoscopic optic nerve decompression. Visual recovery was defined as improvement in 2 Snellen's lines at 1 month post-injury. So we had 53 patients with indirect, of which 6 had recovery inadequacy, altered sensorium. So remaining 21 were included in our study. So the mean age of the patient was 31.6 years, and majority of them, 90% were males. Road traffic accident was the most common cause, identified in 17 patients, that is 81%. The mean time of presentation was around 3.65 hours. So these were the demographic data which we studied. Around 71% of the patients presented within 4 hours of injury. We had 28.5% of the patients who presented with orbital wall fractures, and 14.2% presented with facial fractures other than orbit. 38 patients had associated intracranial pathology, and 19 patients had no other pathology. So 13 patients, the vision at presentation was PL negative in 13 patients, and 662 PL plus in 5 patients, and more than 660 in 3 patients. 18 patients underwent steroid therapy, of which 4 showed visual improvement. 3 patients underwent surgical decompression, of which 1 showed improvement. So when we studied the association of these factors with visual improvement at 1 month, we found that vision at presentation was the only factor which was significantly associated with visual improvement at 1 month. So those with PL plus and above, who presented with PL plus and above vision, had a 12 times higher chance of getting visual improvement at 1 month compared to those with PL negative vision. None of the other factors were significant. So our study did not find any significant difference in those patients treated with low-dose steroids or those treated surgically. The only significant factor which we found was vision at presentation. So this is in concordance with the International Optic Nerve Trauma Study and a study by Lee et al. So low-dose steroids was used only in one another study in Singapore. That also proved no difference in visual recovery of the steroid-treated group and conservative group. So vision at presentation determines the final visual outcome in patients with TON, irrespective of the etiology and treatment modalities. So to conclude, this study highlights the importance of protective measures, use of protective measures like helmet and seat belts to avoid irreversible visual morbidity, which is preventable. The limitation of my study is that we had a smaller sample size and it's a retrospective design. Thank you.
Okay, fine. So just I want to know, as it is a competitive session, what is your investigation of choice in such cases? If I ask you to do one investigation only, what will be your choice of investigation? Because it's very difficult to tackle on those type of patients.
Sir, CT will be my choice of investigation, sir. CT brain and orbit.
CT or MRI?
Sir, these patients may have intraocular foreign bodies. Sometimes unsuspected magnetic foreign bodies might be there. So I feel CT will be safer.
Yeah, but most of the time there may be a blunt injury, vascular etiology, So yes, one. So that your answer should be ideally if we can exclude the magnetic foreign body, choice of investigation is definitely MRI. Okay, good study. Okay.
I think
Okay,
let's
so
invite our next speaker.
yeah. So up next we have Dr. Rebecca. Dr. Rebecca, are you present?
Yeah, I'm there.
Okay, so you're visible, so you can start sharing your screen.
Yeah, all right.
Can we have the timer for her, please?
So is my screen visible now?
Yes,
Yeah,
doctor.
you're audible and it's visible also. You can go ahead with your presentation, Rebecca.
Okay, thank you so much. So good morning, one and all. I would be presenting the 6 years data from a tertiary care center related to the Diwali ocular firecracker injuries and the impact of current legislation in the Delhi NCR region. I do not have any financial disclosures. Well, firecrackers, they constitute an important part of the festivities and celebrations worldwide. In India, you see that especially during the Diwali, but it becomes a menace because there are a lot of firecracker related injuries, and incidence of ocular injury has been reported to be as high as 45%. Bilateral ocular involvement may be seen in up to 30% of the cases. So we must understand that firecracker injuries are largely avoidable, and legislation has proven to show that they are effective in a lot of countries like US, UK, Norway. But in India, well, as per the ruling of the apex court of the country, the Delhi NCR region, it has been observing a temporary ban on the sale of firecrackers since 2017. That is quite recent. But there are a lot of loopholes in this ban. The ban is not a nationwide ban, and it exempts the green firecrackers. But the composition of green firecrackers have not been defined. So this has resulted in the illegal sale of firecrackers during the Diwali season. So what's the lacunae? There are no large-scale studies related to ocular firecracker injuries, and none that have compared the trend before and after the ban that was imposed on the Delhi NCR region. So ours was a retrospective single-centric hospital record-based study that was done at RP Center, AIIMS, New Delhi. Ethical clearance was obtained from the AIIMS Ethics Committee. The medical records of the patient were obtained. The patients who presented with the ocular firecracker injuries to the either casualty or in the outpatient department during the 10 days of the Diwali period. And it was done for the 6 years, that is 2014 to 2019. The 2020 data was not included because the COVID would have impacted our results. And we just studied the clinical demographic profile. The results were, overall, there were 646 patients that involved 667 eyes during the 6 years. Bilateral involvement was seen in around 3% of the cases. Majority were adolescent males, and the youngest being a 3-year-old child. The most common associated firecracker that led to injury was bombs or string bombs. 35% cases were innocent bystanders. None were using protective wear. Majority of children had no adult supervision while using the firecrackers. So this was the trend that we saw in the past 6 years. We see that after the regulation in 2017, a statistically significant reduction, that is almost 50% reduction, more than that, was noted. So the cases almost halved after the ban. The states from which the patient presented, well, majority of the patients were from outside Delhi, especially from the neighboring state of Uttar Pradesh and Haryana. So this also, reveals the inadequacy of trauma management services in these neighboring regions. Then duration of presentation, 3/4 of the patients, had a delayed presentation. They presented after 24 hours of the occurrence of injury. And that's probably because they presented from outside Delhi. And an association was seen between a delayed presentation and a poor visual acuity. As we can see that majority of patients with no PL, they had a delayed duration of presentation. Then comparing this data pre and post regulation, we found that early presentation was significantly higher in the patients who during the post-regulation period. So this is probably because of the improved awareness that was seen after the ban that encouraged them to seek early treatment. Visual acuity at presentation, well, as we can see, more than 80% of the cases have a vision of finger counting close to face or less than that. 27% of them presenting with no perception of light. And a bilateral vision of less than 6/60 was seen in around 2% cases. So, and as we know that presenting visual acuity is an important predictor of the final visual outcome. So considering this, a large number of our patients are expected to eventually become blind. Now, comparing this data pre and post regulation, we found that a higher percentage, significantly higher percentage of patients in the pre-regulation period had a poor presenting visual acuity. As per the Betz classification, majority were open globe injuries, had penetrating perforating trauma, and that's why inpatient care was needed in almost 75% of these cases. What are the limitations of the study? Well, although our study is the largest case series of the ocular firecracker injuries, we cannot ignore these limitations that it's a retrospective study. So the visual outcomes, final visual outcomes could not be obtained. Then being a tertiary center, there's a referral bias. We tend to see much more severe cases. And this also implies that most of the cases, majority bulk, that is mild to moderate cases, are managed at primary and secondary eye care levels. So what we are reporting is just the tip of the iceberg, and the problem is actually much more humongous. So therefore, to conclude, I would say that a study shows a reassuring trend of decreasing number of firecracker ocular injuries after the ban in the Delhi NCR region. But since the cases still continue to pour in, that to severe cases from the neighboring regions, therefore there is a need to minimize this problem further by a nationwide strict ban and promotion of safe use of firecrackers, especially in the susceptible age group, which was the adolescent and children. And also considering that our tertiary center is receiving so many severe trauma case referrals during Diwali, this highlights the inadequacy of the primary and secondary eye care levels to manage severe trauma. And therefore, there is a need to improve the trauma management services at primary and secondary levels. And maybe also we should impart basic level of training to the residents so that the trauma could be managed even at primary and secondary levels timely without any undue delay. Thank you.
Yeah, just I want to know your percentage of open globe injury in your study.
So the percentage of open globe injury that I shown, it was around 67% that we were seeing, sir. I'll just show my...
Without any primary repair.
So yes, sir, this is without any primary repair, sir.
Yeah.
Because more...
So
yes,
can you tell me the distance travel the patient from to your institute?
So distance that usually the patient would travel, would be like the neighboring states that they take. So it takes around 24 hours for them to reach. They refer to first, they go to some ophthalmologist or a primary center where they are given a conservative management, maybe a patch and few drops or maybe antibiotics or a Tetvac. And by the time they reach to us, actually surgical intervention is not done, sir. So the delayed presentation is what we see, and therefore the prognosis is also poor in a lot of cases.
So I want to know, because you are mentioning that due to the lack of the infrastructure in those areas, because
yes,
without doing study, what are the infrastructure pattern?
Yes,
it's very difficult. There may be some political, because from UP government, Haryana, they may raise some issues in our scientific paper. Basically, without doing any such judgment by yourself or any field work, you cannot comment. That's one of the things. Otherwise, it's very good paper. So that I think for your in future, you can omit those until unless you do have a proof concrete.
Yeah. Thank you, sir.
Okay, doctors, the time is up. Thank you so much for such an informative and fantastic session. Now, may I please invite our next speaker, Dr. Purva Walvikar. Dr. Priyam was supposed to invite her, but of course, she's having some technical issues and she'll be joining us as soon as possible.
I'm present.
Then, Dr. Purva Walvikar, please take over.
I'm audible, sir?
Yes, ma'am, you are audible.
Good morning, everyone. I will be presenting a novel 3-point suturing technique of artificial iris for bilateral simultaneous post-traumatic aniridia. I have no financial disclosures. Coming to the case presentation, a 52-year-old female had a blunt trauma to her right eye, followed by left eye in a week's time. It resulted in a massive vitreous hemorrhage with IOL and iris expulsion. Immediate vitrectomy with primary wound repair was done for both eyes. Post-operative examination revealed bilateral attached retina, aphakia, and aniridia. She had persistent complaints related to aniridia, and after 10 months of bilateral simultaneous AI implantation was planned. In view of her high myopia, IOL implantation was deferred. Her vision in right eye was 6/12, and in left amblyopic eye, it was 6/18. Due to her bilateral uniridic condition, she was given a choice to select her eye color, and she chose to match it with her husband. A custom-made artificial iris of desired color was ordered. Coming to the surgical technique, AI was prepared by manually trephining it to 11 mm. A radial marker was used to ascertain 3 suture points at 4, 8, and 12 o'clock position. Edges of foldable AI were cut, which marks the suturing position. Also, it created a small peripheral iridectomies, which can prevent the complications like secondary glaucoma. A radial marker with tryptophan blue is used to mark the scleral spots at 4, 8, and 12 o'clock position, and corresponding partial thickness scleral flaps were made. Artificial iris was sutured with 10-0 polypropylene suture. Intraocular fixation was done with a long curved needle. It is inserted through superior limbal incision and retrieved through scleral pockets at 4 and 8 o'clock position. A folded AI was placed in a Busin glide tip, which was inserted through superior 3 mm incision. Suturing at 12 o'clock position was done with a curved needle. At follow-up, there was a successful relief to her patient's unpleasant symptoms with satisfactory cosmetic outcome. Her vision in right eye improved to 6.6 and maintained to 6/18 in her left eye. Anterior segment OCT showed well-centered, well-placed AI in a sulcus. Good color match was obtained with her husband's eyes. Coming to the theoretical part of artificial iris, it was developed by Human Optics in close collaboration with Professor Koch. It has certain advantages like color customization, excellent optical features, diameter of 12 mm, pupillary aperture of 3.35 mm. It is made up of a foldable material with minimal invasion. It can be used. It is a biocompatible and can be used in partial as well as total aniridia. Coming to the other techniques of aphakia and aniridia correction, artisan reconstruction IOL can be used in a partial aniridia, which is placed in anterior chamber with incision size of 5 to 8.5 mm. Gui et al. Used sutureless intrascleral fixation of AI IOL complex. It needs PC support and long corneal incision. Spitzer et al. Used 4-point transscleral Z suturing technique, which does not require flaps or knots. Presenting here with our experiences with various case scenarios. In first case, a foldable IOL was sutured to the posterior surface of AI. It was an open sky surgery with corneal transplant where 4-point suture fixation was done. In second case, the iris claw was enclaved and fixed to the posterior surface of AI. It required 6.5 mm incision and 4-point fixation. In third case, a foldable IOL was sutured and inserted through 4 mm. So coming to the unique features of our technique, this was a first report of simultaneous bilateral AI implantation in a post-traumatic case. We used a small incision approach, reducing surgical astigmatism and efficient use of Busin glide tip. We found 3-point suture fixation was safer and stable in cases with no capsular support. We used unique marking technique, which also served as a peripheral iridectomy. Thank you.
I think judges, if you have any questions for Dr. Purva Walvekar.
Is there any pre-op photograph of your patient's other eye?
I'll just
Pre-operative photograph of your patient's other eye, because it's a competitive session.
so I'll share my screen.
Yeah.
So these are the pre-op photos.
Okay. Yeah. Okay, then post up, please.
So these are the immediate post-op and these are the at follow-up.
Okay, that your study was conducted in which part of our country?
So I did my fellowship in Italy and it was conducted there.
Okay, in Italy. Okay,
Yes.
that was my confusion. Okay, fine. Yeah. Okay.
Okay, so I think we have Dr. Priyam over here. I would request.
Yeah, so
Yeah.
can we have Dr. Sonakshi Shirawat? Dr. Sonakshi Shirawat, are you here? Okay, she's not here. Then we'll move on to Dr. Deepti P for the next
Yes.
presentation.
I'm here, Priya ma'am.
Okay, okay, madam. So, ma'am, you are visible and audible.
Audible, can I start?
Yes. Ma'am, you can start your presentation then.
Good morning, judges. Tackling pediatric orbital fracture when less is more. Pediatric blowout fractures have unique mechanistic and healing patterns, yet it is managed according to adult fracture pattern guidelines. Having multidisciplinary management, there is a lot of bias with respect to indication and timing of surgery. Risks of early orbital surgery in children include detrimental changes to facial skeletal growth as well as risk of anesthesia. So in this study, we compared functional outcome in children with blowout fracture, comparing surgical and non-surgical management groups and proposed a possible management protocol. 38 patients aged less than 18 years with pure orbital blowout fracture was assessed totally for ocular manifestation, including diplopia charting, test charting, and in-ophthalmos measurement. CT scan was done in all children to assess type and site of fracture. Based on the CT scan, they were divided into Group A involving trapdoor fractures and white-eye blowout fractures. Group B involving throat fractures with herniation. Group C involving depressed floor fractures. Group A underwent immediate surgery within 48 hours. In Group B and C, we assessed the extraocular movement. If there was a gross motility restriction, we performed surgery. But if there was mild or nil motility restriction, we did a conservative management. Children were followed up from 2 weekly interval till 2 months. At 6 weeks, if there was persistent diplopia or worsening of in-ophthalmos, we did a surgery within a period of 2 months. Criteria for success was nil diplopia, in-ophthalmos hypoglobus, and extraocular muscle restriction of less than 5 degrees in upgaze. Total number of patients were 38, of which majority were males. The age range of mean 12.4 years. The most common mechanism of injury was injury. Group A, that is trapdoor fracture, there were totally 7 patients, 5 of whom had white-eye blowout fracture with oculocardiac reflex as shown in this photo. Group B, majority of them underwent a transconjunctival incision. 6 out of 7 were success. 1 patient had residual 10 PV upgaze diplopia. In Group B, we had totally 19 patients. 3 surgery, 16 conservative. 14 out of 16 were successful. 2 had persistent diplopia and underwent surgery. All 5 were surgically treated successfully as shown in these photos. Group C, totally 12 patients, 2 underwent surgery, 10 were managed conservatively, 70% success rate, 3 had in-ophthalmos and persistent diplopia, so they underwent surgery at 6 weeks of age and were managed successfully. 1 had residual 10 PV case restriction as shown in this photo and was considered unsuccessful. Totally, there were 38 patients, of which 31 were non-trapdoor fractures, 21 were managed conservatively, that is 68%, and 10 underwent surgery. The difference between the outcome between the 2 groups was insignificant. How do we manage the non-trapdoor fractures in children remains a big enigma with respect to timing of repair as well as indications of repair. Should we rely on CT? No. In contrast to adults, the size of the fracture in children does not correlate with in-ophthalmos diplopia as shown in this image. Herniation does not correlate with that of diplopia or upward gaze restriction. In-ophthalmos, in contrast to adults, up till 3 mm were tolerated by parents in our study as shown in this image. 13-year-old boy with 3 mm in-ophthalmos, parents declined surgery. It's time to shift the paradigm to clinical science. assess extraocular movements. If there is a gross restriction, be it trapdoor or non-trapdoor, perform an immediate surgery. But if there is a mild or nil movement restriction, we can wait and watch till 6 weeks of age. Why? Because diplopia starts to resolve by 2 weeks of age and enophthalmos appears only by 4 to 6 weeks of age for the parents to decide whether surgery is needed. Can the wait be justified? Yes. There are multiple studies which show that in children at around 3 to 4 months of age, there is neobone formation, joining of bony edges, and the herniated content spontaneously reduced within the orbital cavity, resulting in spontaneous resolution of diplopia as well as enophthalmos. So conclusion, we all know that trapdoor fractures in children require immediate surgery. We did not know how to manage non-trapdoor fractures in children. So this study proved that surgery can be delayed till edema and inflammation resolve. Surgery at 6 weeks only if clinically significant diplopia or noticeable enophthalmos by a minimal transconjunctival scarless incision. This is the flowchart which we have proposed for management. Limitations is small sample size, references, and I would like to conclude that in children with pediatric blowout fractures, less is the new mode. Thank you.
Thank you so much, doctor, for finishing it on time. We have a minute.
Any
for,
questions from the
questions.
judges? Any questions from judges for madam?
Dr. Deepti.
Morning, sir.
Yeah, good morning. How will manage? Suppose in case of a pediatric case and there is a immediately in your emergency room trapdoor fracture, how will you manage immediately?
Sir, in emergency with respect to?
With significant bradycardia.
Yes, sir. Those were there. Nearly 5 out of 7. Majority of the children they presented to us with white-eyed blowout fracture. They had oculocardiac reflex, so we admitted them immediately under the pediatrician guidance, and their bradycardia as well as nausea, vomiting were managed. And as early as possible, within 24 hours, we posted them for surgery, reduced all the herniated content so that their oculocardiac reflex as well as bradycardia goes down, sir. There were 1 or 2 which were actually misdiagnosed as neurological problem, and they were referred late to us at around 3 days of age post injury. Those were the ones which highlighted that we have to assess the oculocardiac reflex and white-eyed blowout fracture in any trapdoor fracture of children.
Sir, requesting you to take up the next speaker. Can we do that, sir? We are a little pressed for time. Okay. So the next speaker is Dr. Kirandeep Kaur. Dr. Kirandeep, can we have you?
Morning, ma'am.
Yes. So you're visible and audible. You can start.
Good morning, one and all. I will be presenting the topic is traumatic intralenticulaar abscess and evolving spectrum of endophthalmitis. The authors have no financial disclosures. The intralenticular abscess is defined as collection of yellow pus-like material within the lens substance, which occurs secondary to trauma, cataract surgery, or from a metastatic infection. So in this study, we will be dealing with the traumatic intralenticular abscess, that is the intralenticular abscess that occurs secondary to trauma. So the mechanism is following penetrating injury whenever there is a rupture of the anterior capsule. So if the infection accompanies a purulent infiltration, can result in a lens abscess. Lens acts as an excellent culture medium where organism grows luxuriantly. Organisms once in the lens are able to multiply at a rapid rate before they can be reached by the pus cells, thus leading to the formation of a lens abscess. So the unsolved questions in this regard are how to distinguish the lens abscess from a complicated cataract or endophthalmitis. Can be diagnosed without doing a histopathology. What is the importance of status of posterior capsule? What is the importance of vitreous echoes and B scan? How to distinguish between vitritis and endophthalmitis? And what is the role of ear spacity in these patients?
So the purpose of our study was to retrospectively analyze the demographic risk factors, clinical profile, management and outcomes of these patients, as well as to describe for first time the novel use of ASOCT in patients with traumatic intraventricular abscess. The study was done in a retrospective way after approval from the IRB of our hospital. It was done over a period of 2 years in which recorded 169 eyes of patients that presented with open label injuries were evaluated, and patients who had a confirmed diagnosis based on clinical examination, ASOCT and B-scan with a minimum follow-up 3 months were included in the study for analysis. The exclusion criteria was ASOCT not revealing a heterogeneous lenticular opacity or with no clear history of trauma. 17 eyes were included and analyzed in our study. The pre and intraoperative treatment protocols included topical and systemic broad spectrum antibiotic with or without antifungals from the time of presentation, followed by small incision cataract surgery with or without cornea or corneoscleral tear repair, lens aspirate to send for histopathological analysis, intracameral moxifloxacin or antifungal in form of voriconazole were injected at the end of surgery. Intravitreal antibiotics or core vitrectomy decision was based upon the vitreous involved. So post-operatively, antibiotic and antifungals were continued based on clinical picture and culture results. Steroids were started after a period of 1 week of inflammatory quiescence, but in fungal cases, a minimum interval of 2 weeks was given. So patients were closely followed up after 3 months of inflammatory quiescence, and IOL was implanted as a staged procedure later. So the age of the patients ranged from 12 to 74 years with a mean age of 46.82. There was equal representation from both the genders in our study. The major source of injury were found to be stick, followed by thorn and caterpillar hairs in our study. The mean presenting best corrected visual acuity was 1.82, which improved to 0.63 till the final present. So the presentation lag was from 3 to 32 days with a mean presentation lag of 8.72. We had only one patient that presented after one, that was on 32nd day following trauma in form of a traumatic endophthalmitis and a secondary glaucoma at the time of presentation itself. So ASOCT revealed a dense heterogeneous lenticular opacity in 100% of the patients. Infiltrates between iris and lens were present in 4 patients. There was a breach in the posterior capsule on ASOCT in 2 patients. Vitritis was present on B-scan in 10 patients, and 3 patients showed progressive vitritis with exudates. Thus, 3 out of 17 patients developed endophthalmitis in our study. The lens aspirate showed bacteria in 7 cases, fungal growth in 3 cases, and was culture negative in 7 cases. Among the bacterial cases, 5 were secondary to staph epidermidis, 1 each of Novardia and Moraxella. Among the fungal cases, 2 were secondary to Fusarium and 1 was secondary to Aspergillus. Coming to the surgical intervention, 6 patients underwent SICS alone with intracameral antibiotics, while 11 patients needed a tear repair with SICS and intracameral antibiotics. Pars plana vitrectomy was needed in 2 of our patients, and secondary IOL implantation was later on done in 15 cases. So the best corrected visual acuity of more than 20/80 was achieved in 15 out of the 17 patients, but the mean BCVA was 0.63. So the 2 patients who had poor vision were the patients who had non-resolving endophthalmitis, out of which 1 ended up in irises. And this was the patient who presented to us with who had a late presentation. Coming to the discussion, traumatic intralenticular abscess may camouflage a complicated cataract. It is mainly caused by penetrating trauma, and the most common organisms reported in studies are Staphylococcus epidermidis and Aspergillus niger, though other rare organisms have also been reported. So sharp objects inoculates organism directly into lens metal by breaching the anterior capsule. This manifests as an intralenticular abscess and anterior chamber inflammation. In these cases, penetration of antibiotics is difficult. Best treatment is to drain the abscess at the earliest along with appropriate intracameral and systemic antibiotics with or without antifungals. Thus, drainage of abscess leads to eradication of organisms successfully, and there is no need of pars plana vitrectomy in all these cases at an early stage. But even with rapid strides and advancement of IOL surgery, primary IOL implantation should be avoided as per our experience in these cases. This prevents possible adherence of microbes on the IOL surface or at the optic-haptic junction. For most of the infection, it remains confined to the capsular bag despite presence of vitreous cells on B-scan. Thus, it is very important to use the role of ASOCT in these patients to look for the integrity of posterior
Sorry to
capsule.
interrupt, Dr. Kirandi, but the time is up.
I'll just present this one slide, sir. This is important. So, although the infection appears to be confined within the capsule with a clear vitreous, a dumbbell extension of the lens abscess is very important. It should be looked upon.
Time up, please.
Thank you.
Dr. Kirandeep, you need to conclude. Your time is over. Judges, can we have the questions for Dr. Kirandeep, please?
Yeah. Dr. Kirandeep, in your study, significant number of patients are culture negative out of 6 or I think 7.
7 patients were considered.
So why, on what ground you will justify as a abscess? What are the other criteria to say abscess, lenticular abscess
Sir,
in a
so-
culture negative?
Yes, sir. Sir, the main diagnosis that is based upon the ASOCT. So in ASOCT, we were seeing a heterogeneous lenticular opacity that was taken as one evidence of an intralenticular abscess, even if the culture was negative, sir, in these patients. So that was the criteria used. And plus the other thing we want to emphasize was the role of dumbbell sign in B-scan. That is very important and gives an early indication of early endophthalmitis. Even if we are feeling it is only a traumatic lens abscess, we need to deal these patients as an early end of patients.
Okay.
Okay, I think that's we'll conclude this, and now I request Dr. Priyam to take over, please.
Yes, so Professor Tariq Qureshi, sir, he has his keynote address. So, Tariq, sir, are you here? Tariq Qureshi, sir, you'll have to unmute yourself.
Sir, I'll send you a notification. Just press on unmute.
Tariq, sir, you'll have to start your video and audio.
Please unmute now.
Okay.
Again on mute.
Dr. Tariq, please unmute yourself.
Presentation, should we?
Yes.
Audible?
Tariq, sir, you're audible now and visible, so you can start sharing your screen, sir.
Good morning, everybody, and thanks to AIOS organizers for such a difficult and tough show and connecting us from all the parts of the country. And right now we are face to face with each other. I'll be presenting the trauma cases, and trauma, you know, as is one of the main parts of the ocular injuries for its morbidity and the visual loss. And I'll be presenting pallet ocular trauma, and pallet is a short gun which is used for controlling the crowds. It's used for recreation sports. Right now you are seeing a patient of a pallet injury who has received pallet and has resulting in traumatic cataract and a vitreous hemorrhage within intraocular. We are doing a 3-port pars plana 20 gauge vitrectomy. You can see that we are removing the vitreous scaffold from as a core vitrectomy. Then we are proceeding to the pars plana and removing the peripheral vitreous. And these patients, they have a difficult induction of posterior vitreous detachment, and we could not find any cause why in these patients the posterior vitreous detachment was not easily detached. Probably the cause was that most of them were either 18 to 12 years of age or even younger age, where the vitreous is quite gel and less of the liquid. Here you can see that peripheral vitreous is being cleared, and once peripheral vitreous is being cleared, we are now trying for a posterior vitreous detachment. One turn, second turn, and third turn, and now see the vitreous detachment is there. Once the vitreous detachment is induced, you just clear a hole of the vitreous, because if you leave any scaffold of vitreous in the vicinity, either in the posterior pole or the peripheral retina, it acts as a traction band and may result in a giant retinal tear. Once the core part of the vitreous is removed, we go to the periphery of the globe and with indentation clear even the last bit of the vitreous. Otherwise, it acts as a part of traction and may result in repeat retinal detachment. In palate injuries, this has been a difficult vitrectomy because once we remove the vitreous, the posterior wound is leaky. So one has to maintain the intraocular pressure between 25 and 30 millimeters only. Otherwise, there is a leaky wound and it may end up in a phthisis postoperatively or a hypotomy. So palate trauma or palate vitrectomy is not that easy as we have seen. Now we have reached the position of a peripheral vitreous where the localized retinal detachment is there. You can see this retinal detachment pocket at 7 o'clock where the palate is lodged, and this area is totally detached while the rest of it is all attached. We are removing the vitreous scaffold and vitreous attachment from its base and to the margins of the detachment. And now you will see that we'll go to the next step where whatever the vitreous is left over, it's removed. Once it's removed, we then remove the palate from the surface of the retina. Here we're again stuck up with little bit of vitreous which is not coming up, and now you can see it's peeled off along with the streak of vitreous hemorrhage, and this retinal detachment is quite evident. The retinal detachment is localized. It's localized to 7 to 9 o'clock hours, and so it's not affecting the macula, and post-operative visual problem would not be there. But the problem is there is a lot of subretinal blood which has to be drained. Now the superior part of the retinal part, detachment part, is being cleared. Here is the fovea, which is all clear, but the base of vitreous is cleared, and the margin of the retinal detachment, there is a little more attachment of vitreous. The vitreous, once it is removed, one is fully satisfied. One can use triamcinolone estronyl 4 milligrams. Then this is another patient who had a palate, who had primary repair, but still has traumatic cataract and hyphema. We usually do it 5 to 6 days after vitrectomy because that way the wound integrity becomes clear, and at the same time the media becomes clear. He also has a dense vitreous hemorrhage. We have removed the traumatic cataract. We have cleared the vitreous base. Now we are going to the posterior pole. You can see this is the subretinal palate in this patient. We are dislodging it from the subretinal space into the vitreous. And once the palate is in the vitreous, we separate it from the vitreous margins, clear it from the vitreous tractions, because if we pull it with the forceps, it's going to pull the retina. Then what we do, we make a conjunctival flap, cauterize the base of the limbus, and make a 4.5 millimeter incision. This is a tripod forceps, which was innovated here with this, along with the help of the Dr. Natarajan from Mumbai. And once we engage it, we increase the size of the wound and pull it out. You can see this palate, and you can see this palate has multiple faceted ball. Once we did it, we have to go for attachment of the retina, doing a fluid exchange, endolaser, and silicone oil injection. Right now, we are doing endolaser over the margin of the exit wound at the site of the perforation. This is another case who had a detachment previously and had a redetachment, and now we have reattached the retina and we're putting the silicone oil. Silicone oil acts as a tamponade and has to be removed after 4 to 6 weeks. Another case with traumatic cataract and the vitreous hemorrhage. Vitreous hemorrhage is much denser. Traumatic cataract has been removed, and we are in the core of the vitrectomy, removing all the vitreous. This is the biome that we use for visualization and see how dense the hemorrhage is. And in such cases, there is every chance, if you are not very careful, one may have a break in the retina or a large tear in the retina. What we usually do, we choose the nasal part of the vitreous, clear the whole of the vitreous there, and see little part of the fundal globe, and then proceed to PVD and then remove it. Done. We have removed core vitreous, we have removed peripheral vitreous, but the situation is quite bad. There's a large tear over the macular area and with multiple hemorrhages. We have done a fluid exchange followed by a silicone oil injection. These patients are monitored post-operatively for development of the intraocular pressure, band keratopathy, but most of them are tackled by removal of the silicone oil. Doing these palate injuries.
Dr. Tariq, request you to conclude, please. Your time is up. I'm sorry.
Responded. The conclusion about the study is around 1,500 patients of palate injuries were removed, and most of them were 18 years of age, and 30% of them had vitreous hemorrhage with retinal detachment, and 80% of the patients had 612 to 618 vision, while only 10% had less than 660% vision. Thank you.
So thank you for the keynote address, sir. That was wonderful. So moving on to the next speaker, Dr. Sangeet Mittal, are you here?
Hello.
Yeah, I'm here.
Yeah. Dr. Sangeet Mittal, sir, you're audible and visible. Tariq, sir, if you can stop sharing your screen.
Okay.
Orbit 2.
Sir, shall I share my screen now?
Yes, sir. You can go ahead, share your screen, sir. So you're audible and visible. You can start with your presentation, sir.
Right. So my talk for today is prophylactic chorioretectomy for deep impact ocular trauma in Indian eyes. So this the technique of chorioretinectomy was first introduced in 1987 by George von Olmec as a therapeutic purpose, but Ferenc Kuhn actually in 2004 as a prophylactic for the prevention of PVR from the wound site after the surgery. So it is mainly for deep impact ocular trauma with vitreous incarceration or penetration of the choroid. It can be done as a prophylactic or a therapeutic measure. And to understand, let us consider this case. This was a patient of double perforating injury who had endophthalmitis and vitreous hemorrhage. So once the entry wound was cleaned, the vitrectomy was done. You notice here inferiotemporally there is an exit wound. At this point, the exit wound was left as such, but later on, you see the growth of epiretinal membrane from the exit wound side. So if the patient was for the patient was again taken up for the surgery and the membrane was removed. After the removal of the membrane, this 100% deep diathermy burns were given around this exit wound. And then the choroid and the retina was removed using either the cautery itself or with the vitreous cutter to the level of bare sclera. And it was taken care that the major blood vessels were not harmed. You see the sclera is shining through now. Any bleeding was controlled using again endodiathermy. And then one row of laser was given around this exit wound, followed by a fluid air exchange and injection of a long-acting gas. So this was post-operative, 20 days post-operative, the patient's vision improved to 6/24. And 2 months post-operative, the patient's vision was 6/18, though there was some intraretinal hemorrhages indicative of a branch vein occlusion, but it was not affecting the vision as such. So we conducted a study to evaluate the limitations of performing prophylactic chorioretinectomy for deep impact ocular trauma in Indian eyes, and it was a retrospective case series. 11 eyes of penetrating eye injury with or without intraocular foreign body underwent this procedure. Vitreous was incarcerated in posterior retina in all these cases. Visual acuity was more than accurate projection of rays, and the patients underwent 25 or 27 gauge Parsegna vitrectomy with wide angle non-contact viewing system. A vitreous-based excision followed by foreign body removal, chorioretinectomy, endolaser, and a gas or silicone oil tamponade was done. So this is how we do it. The patient of a sorry for that. This intraocular foreign body. So the intraocular foreign body once was separated from the site. Again, 100% deep diathermy burns were given around this exit wound around this wound. And after that, the choroid and the retina was eaten up with the help of the vitreous cutter to the level of where sclera was exposed. And once the chororetinectomy was complete, the foreign body was lifted up from the retinal surface and removed to an additional sclerotomy using a claw forceps. At the end of procedure, a fluid air exchange followed by gas injection was done. Again, 1 to 2 rows of laser can be done around this choroidectomy. This is post-operative. The patient was 6/6, and the observational results. All patients were male, and average age was 28.3 plus minus 12.1 years. Intraocular foreign body inside the globe was impacted in 7 eyes. Exit wound was seen in 2 eyes. There was a patient with a knife injury in 1 eye and a cow's horn injury in another 1 eye. There was a retinal detachment associated with the intraocular foreign body or with the trauma in 4 eyes. Endophthalmitis in 1 eye, and significant vitreous hemorrhage in 4 eyes, and subretinal hemorrhage in 2 eyes. So silicone oil tamponade was used in 45% eyes and gas tamponade in 36.4% eyes. The post-operatively, all eyes, the retina was attached. There was a recurrent PVR in 2 eyes. Visual acuity improvement was seen in 10 eyes, and BRVO vision was seen in 1 eye. So these are the few patients: the double perforation injury, the cow's horn injury, the impacted intraocular foreign body injury, showing the no recurrence of PVR in these cases. So this was another embedded intraocular foreign body and a knife injury. To conclude, the chorioretinectomy is a relatively new procedure, but it may prevent exit site wound-related PVR and fibrous ingrowth into the retina from the wound site, and it may be considered as a prophylactic or therapeutic option. Thank you.
So thank you so much for concluding before time. I would request our moderators to please go ahead with the questions.
Dr. Mehta, this is an excellent one. Hello.
Hello. Yes, yes sir.
But I want to know, there is 2 cases, I think. Porta wall perforation, double group perforation. It was in due to the iron foreign body, or what was the etiology in those cases?
So it was an iron foreign body.
Okay. In such cases, manage the case intraocularly. What will be the other options? In case of a double globe perforation, is there any other invention you recommend? Any investigation?
So we generally do first we do an X-ray of the orbit and followed by a CT of the orbit just to locate where the intraocular foreign body is. And generally we don't try to remove if the intraocular foreign body has crossed the eye until and unless it is the vitrectomy is not done until and unless it is associated with some other complication also.
Because sometimes it may adjacent to the object. Okay, fine. Yes, time is up.
Yes, thank you so much, doctors.
Okay. Sir, moving on to the next presentation and the last presentation of this session. Of course, a keynote address is remaining. So, Dr. Urvashi Kala, are you here? Dr. Urvashi Kala?
Yeah, hello.
Hello. Yeah, you're audible and you're visible. You can start sharing your screen, please.
Okay, ma'am. Are my slides visible?
Yeah.
Yes, they are visible. You're audible. You can start on with your presentation, Dr. Urvashi.
Yeah. Good morning to all the panelists, judges, and the fellow presenters. So I'll be presenting a case presentation on scleral foreign body mimicking as episcleritis, which presented as a clinical dilemma to us. So I'm the presenting author. There are no financial disclosures. So I'm going to present 2 cases which of deeply buried scleral foreign body mimicking episcleritis. So in the first case, a 28-year-old male patient presented to us with redness in his left eye associated with giddiness for the past 1 month. Visual acuity in both eyes was 6/6. The pupillary reactions were round, the pupils were round, regular, and equally reacting. On examination, we found a well-defined subconjunctival nodule measuring 5 mm into 3 mm with pigmentation in the superior temporal quadrant in the left eye. AC was quiet and lens was clear. Rest of the examination was within normal limits. Right eye anterior segment evaluation was within normal limits. The fundus in both eyes was within normal limits. So on the basis of examination, we made a suspicion of foreign body and an X-ray orbit was done. The X-ray revealed a linear opacity in the superior nasal quadrant. On detailed history taking, further probing the patient gave a history of foreign body falling in his eye 1 month ago. So CT scan was done to confirm the diagnosis, and foreign body was confirmed lying in the superficial ocular cords in the superior nasal quadrant. Globe exploration was done and foreign body removal was done under local anesthesia. Intraoperatively, we found an iron foreign body, iron piece embedded deep in the sclera, not perforating it. It was removed and scleral suturing was done with 80 nylon sutures. Post-operatively, the patient was given topical steroids and antibiotics, and follow-up was uneventful. This was the size, like this big a foreign body was found. In a similar case, in the second case, a 13-year-old male presented with a localized nodular swelling in the left eye associated with pain since last 1 month. Similar to the previous case, vision was unaffected, pupils were round, regular, and equally reacting. And on examination, it showed a painless paralimbal swelling temporally at 3 o'clock in the left eye. The anterior segment AC was quiet at clear lens. Rest of the anterior segment examination was within normal limits. Right eye examination was normal and fundus was within normal limits. So similarly, in this case also, we made a provisional diagnosis of nodular episcleritis. The patient was started on low dose topical steroids. All the investigations like CBC, chest X-ray, and Montus were done to rule out tubercular infection given the age group of the child. But however, no relief of symptoms was observed even after 2 weeks of topical steroids. And all the investigations came out to be normal. So we made a suspicion of a foreign body. So we did a UBM for this child. It revealed a subconjunctival hypoechoic lesion with hyperechoic center in the outer scleral layers, which was suggestive of either a foreign body or a cysticercus cyst. So CCT brain was done to rule out any neurocysticercosis, which did not reveal anything. And on detailed history taking for the probing the patient gave a history of trauma with a pencil 1 month ago. So globe exploration was done under local anesthesia, and from the scleral layers, intraoperatively, a wooden foreign body was found embedded deep in the sclera. And then scleral suturing was done. Post-operatively, patient was given topical steroids and antibiotics, and follow-up was uneventful. So episcleritis usually presents as diffuse redness. The differential diagnoses include conjunctivitis, plectin, foreign body granuloma, scleritis, etc. Any redness in a patient which is not resolving with topical steroids should always raise a suspicion of any local insult, any trauma, or any ocular or systemic disease. So these cases, they highlight the importance of thorough history taking and retrograde revision of the diagnosis and treatment, especially if the patient's response to the treatment is unsatisfactory. In both the cases, in the first presentation, the patient negated any history of trauma. However, when the patient did not have any resolution of symptoms, we further probed the patient. Also, a meticulous slit lamp examination is very important in directing a localized sign like this with multiple differential diagnoses towards the correct treatment. And a foreign body in eye can easily mimic and present as episcleritis. Thank you.
Okay, fine. Very good. So on what ground you suspect it may not be episcleritis, it may be other?
So in the case of a child, he was a school-going child, and the mother gave a history that there was a fight between two children like that. And in case of the adult, his profession, he was a welder by profession. So like that is why I have emphasized that history taking is very important about what is the person's profession, what is the age group. Has there been any local insult like that is why. And also on the slit lamp examination, the appearance of the nodule was very specific, and we could see that there is something beneath the transparent layers of the conjunctiva and the sclera. So that's why.
Which is the investigation of choice in such cases?
The CT is the investigation of choice in cases of metallic foreign body, and ultrasound that in non-metallic ultrasound is the investigation of choice. But in that X-ray was initially done because the patient presented an emergency. So at night time, so that is why like the ancillary investigation X-ray only was available in the government setup, like in the tertiary hospital.
Thank you so much. The time is up.
So now that was a wonderful presentation. So now we have Dr. Sunil Morekar sir to deliver his keynote address. Morekar sir.
Yeah.
Yes, sir.
You see my
Sir, you're audible and visible.
my screen shared?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. It is.
Yeah. So this is the presentation. I thank the organizers and the chairman and the people on the dais. Thank you very much. This was our last year's presentation. That is me. There's no disclosures. We have ocular trauma. We know that there are a huge number of people around the world who are blind due to eye injuries. And I have been one of the persons who has suffered injuries and orbital injuries and fractures myself, not once, but 6 times. So this becomes a very important subject for me. 6 of my severe accidents and across the city of Bombay as well as Navi Mumbai. So the Lackawanna literature is comparing ocular trauma. The rest of the world and the rest of India seems to have conducted a lot of studies with looking at epidemiology of ocular trauma. The East data is there, the Northeast data is there, the North data is there, the South data is there, but there is Lackawanna literature about the metro and the non-metro in Mumbai and Western region. So this is where I started from way back in 1994 about orbital mensuration. And we know that there are issues of trauma which we are not aware of, and so studies are required. Infective agents differ in different regions. We are seeing mucormycosis right now, so we now understand that much more better. Sometimes some patients are very good for 10 years and with an implant, and then suddenly this happens. And then when we look at it and drain it, it turns out to be a cold abscess in the implant, and it's not an implant which was faulty. The implant was good for 10 years. So a long-term follow-up, which is something like this for 10 years, is not something which is available in literature. So the aim of the study was to study the epidemiology of eye injuries in patients with major trauma in 2 cities in India, determining in Western India in metro versus non-metro city, the incidence, etiology, outcomes, and association with fractures. So we questioned everything. We have data of the developed world versus the developing world, and we know that the developing world data differs. So that is rural Nepal we have, and we have Australian data. When we compare that, we see that it is quite different. So the importance of data is that policy can be made based on this data. Western India have different severe accidents. In India, there are only 4 population-based studies of eye injury. There is no major epidemiological study of Western India. So we did an analysis of the trauma audit database data from 43,982 patients on 6 centers across Mumbai and Navi Mumbai. The research adhered to the tenets of Declaration of Helsinki. All medical records were anonymous, and no patient information could be extracted except for the statistics. The visual acuity and all the ocular trauma classification system and the bed score and others were used. A Medline search was done to find out if we have any data which can be compared with this data. The results were 79% were men, so this was predominantly almost 80% men. The median age was 37 years. 65% were ocular injuries were due to road traffic accident. 82% had good outcomes. Mean follow-up for 7 years. 7 years plus or minus 1.8, so that's almost around 10 years. The annual incidence of eye injuries was 24.89 per 1 lakh. The overall age and adjusted prevalence was 17.5 with a 95% confidence level of 17 to 18. The most common injury were men associated with outdoor activity. Closed glove injuries were less severe as expected. The accident severities, which is something which we looked at, and we realized that the accident severity, the number of people killed and the accident severity index, when you look at Mumbai, it is much lesser because it is crowded.
and the speed of the vehicles are lesser. But when you see other cities where the vehicles are moving at a high speed, it is a higher. The preoperative, so the univariate analysis of the preoperative variables, which are there, these are obvious that there is a presence of RAPD, traumatic cataract, hyphema, vitreous loss. The results are going to be bad. So there was nothing different that we found here. Multiple regression analysis of the orbital injury was something that we realized that if there is orbital injury, the visual outcome is going to be bad. That is something that we can keep in mind. 8% had associated ocular injuries when there was orbital fracture, and the risk of eye injury with a facial fracture is 8.2 times more. So the odds of poor prognosis with complex fractures, that is expected, and initial visual acuity very strongly correlated. So your initial visual acuity is PL or no PL, something like that. That is correlating. The imaging is what we use for various imaging like color-coded maps and prognostic image of VP. We did our modeling on basis of the 3D CT scans and MRIs. And sometimes we use titanium meshes. Sometimes we used these meshes and left them in for more than 5 years. Screws based on volumetric, this thing, customized implants. This is our worst case. We need a customized implant all over the skull, and the defect covered, and the vision is 100%. Electric saw injury. These are some examples. Degloving injury of the face, where half of the face has come out, and this patient is doing good over the last 10 years. 3D reconstruction of CT scan is done to look at the chopped bone in a chopper injury. Multiple pellets and foreign bodies inside the eye removed along with the fracture associated with multiple muscle abnormalities. There are hypoglobus, which we have seen, NOE fractures type 1 and NOE fractures type 2, where we have fixed them with bigger, larger screws which are used by orthopedic surgeons. Canalicular system involvement is something that we have seen. NOE type 3 with lacrimal sac resection is what we have seen. The lacrimal sac goes behind. And we have done that, held that with a transnasal wire. And the lacrimal sac is advanced, and the patient is doing good over a period of 4 years now. Sometimes orbital hemorrhage is something that we have missed as mistaken for an orbital fracture. Orbital trauma hemorrhage. Cosmesis is important, and that is something that we have taken care of. We have used staples, we have used glue. We have seen compartment syndromes, roof of fracture, brain gets involved, and your CSF area there. I've just got a couple of slides more. And the orbital roof with levator disinsertion is something that we have seen. And some need endoscopic approach, and some may be treated. The worst cases is something that you may have something like this, where even the optic nerve is involved, and it gets missed because you're concentrating on the front of the eye. In some cases, you may have a up course, and then you may have a necrosis, and then you may come back. So life is like an ECG. If there are no ups and downs, you probably are dead. Foot fractures.
Sir, sorry to interrupt, but time is up.
So hypoglobus, and these are some of the cases where we have drained. So it compares with the Australian data, Singapore data, one long-term study of this thing, rural data, our rural data compares, South Indian data it compares, and we have done these other things. So cost effectivity, we have done similar things, and to our knowledge, this is one of the study of this kind, and it may have potentially experienced patients who have suffered minor ocular trauma, and they might have resolved on their own, like our asymptomatic corneal cases, and gone to other smaller clinics. Conclusion: largest multicentric clinic audit across 2 cities, only in local areas, but a large geographical expanse, and can help in health policy formulation. Those are my references. Thank you. Thank you very much.
So thank you for that wonderful talk. So hereby we can come to the end of this session. It was a wonderful session full of knowledge. I think we all have learned, gained knowledge, and enjoyed it as well. So Chairman sir, Jointu sir, would you like to say something? So what I got an update from sir, unmute yourself, sir. Sir, you're again unmute.
Okay, so we enjoyed that, and all exceptional. It's very new ideas. We are very happy to take part.
Mr. Priyam, could you please mute?
All the members of, including the chairman certificate, Dr. Amit and all, and to give the opportunity to judge those things, and I think everyone did their best. But still, it is a competitive station, and I'm sending the mark sheet to the Amit in his WhatsApp, so he can find it out. Okay. I think we can conclude right now, and if our chairman permits or co-chairman permits, so we can conclude. And I just request Sandana ma'am to say something. Sandana ma'am.
Hello, Dr. Jayanto. Good morning.
Good morning.
This was a nice session. Innovative ideas came across, the lens sepsis aspiration and all that was totally new for us actually. So thank you all for having me judging the session. So that's all.
Pankaj sir, one last word from you, sir.
Yeah, it was nice session and we really enjoyed. Thank you, Priyam, for conducting very nicely.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, sir.
So we have finished the session on time.
Yes, it's on time. Great, Amit.
Dr. Pankaj sir.
Yes, Amit. Very nice. It is on time. Perfect.
Good, good. So Priyam is the next leader, politician in progress.
Yes, it is. Yes. Great.
So thank you all for finishing the session on time.